And this time, the studio just said to the paper, she's finished. So I knew if I stayed around this town that I'd really go mad. In the meantime, Vincent never did anything. Never did anything.
Was he directing a picture?
Oh, I don't know what he was doing. Directing pictures or just nothing. I don't know. And, so I thought I must get well. I don't give a damn whether I ever make another picture as long as I live, but I must get my health back. And not in a mental institution, but in a good hospital, because I knew that I was having another complete nervous breakdown. This would be, you see, I had 2 mild ones, and I was headed for well, they weren't mild, they were pretty bad ones. But this third one would have been just absolute the finish of me. So I got a hold of Jessie Marmiston, a doctor, a woman doctor, and she's at UCLA. She started the whole medical center at UCLA. She's a wonderful doctor. And I asked her to recommend a place where I could go to get well. And she told me the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital in Boston was a marvelous place. Well, I didn't have any money, and each time that I was taken off of a picture, naturally, I was put on suspension, you know. So I've been put on suspension, so I hadn't made any money at all in that year, and no one had ever saved any money for me in all my life. So I didn't have any money to go, and I thought, well, at first I had gone to Louis Mayer and pled with him to put me back in the picture. By then,
how soon after you were passed in the picture did you do this?
About a week.
You went to his office?
No, I went to his home.
You went to his home.
And
who was there? Just you and he?
Just a cousin.
Oh, you and cousin.
And I pleaded him to go back on the picture, and he said that he would be willing to take a chance. And he called, and Dory Sherry said no. And
Dory was in the studio at that time.
So they put Betty Hutton in the picture, and then they decided to go to Boston. And I didn't have the money, and I thought, well, after so many years at Metro, perhaps they'll lend me the money to get well, and I can, when I do get well, I can go back to work decently and pay them back. So I went to Louis Mayer's office and told him that I felt I had to go to Boston. And he agreed, and Jessie Marmiston was there, who was a great friend of his, and told him.
She went with you?
Yes, and Carmen. And he said, by all means, he said, that's the least we can do for you, is to pay for your hospital bills. And it's going to New York first, you know, naturally, to clear it. So he picked up the phone, all confident, talked to Nick Skank, and he put the phone down and he said, Mr. Skank suggests that you go to a charity hospital because we're not in the business in the money lending business. So he just looked at me, I'll never forget what he said. He said, you know, if they'll do this to you, they'll do it to me too.
That's what he said?
Yes.
If they do this to you,
and shortly afterwards, they did give him an awful beating, you know. But anyway, he said that he was so ashamed of their attitude that he personally would pay for whatever expenses I had. So I left for Boston with Carl.
And he advanced you some money? Or he said he would take care of it?
He just said he got the train tickets for Carlton and myself. And because Carlton was still standing by, you know. And so said he would go with me to Boston so I wouldn't have to go all by myself. And and he said, just send all your bills to me. So we went to the Ritz-Carlton in Boston and got a small room for Carlton, and then I checked into the hospital. And I had to, the whole thing is that they...
Did he arrange to pay Carlton? Was Carlton getting any salary or anything? I mean, you know,
No.
just paying expenses. He just was
paying
doing this
expenses.
gratuitously.
Carlton never got anything. Never got anything for all of this. But anyway, I checked into the hospital, and I'll never forget, there were about 2 weeks of tests to be made. You know, they wanted to get a complete checkup first. And in the meantime, they told me, first crack off the bat, that I must learn to eat. That I had to learn to eat. And I had to learn to sleep. So they put me on a diet of 3 big meals a day. And lights out at 9 o'clock at night, whether I slept or not. And they said sooner or later you'll get into the habit of eating and sleeping. So this started immediately. In the meantime, all of these tests had to be made. So nobody called except Frank Sinatra called and sent flowers every day and so forth. It was very sweet, as he is with all sick people. And
Being sick himself.
and I wouldn't put that in the
No,
book.
I'm just kidding.
No. But anyway, he was very kind. He sent he sent a record player and records and flowers and bed jackets and perfume and all kinds of
He was the only one.
Yes, and he called every day.
He called every day,
Yeah.
sent flowers every day.
Yeah.
I mean,
Every
that's
day.
marvelous.
Yeah, it was
I'm
nice.
delighted to hear that.
And he said as soon as the doctors would allow, he would fly to Boston with some friends of mine to visit me.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of kept me going. He was always very funny on the phone and everything. So they had to take tests. Well, it turned out that everything was good. My liver was fine. My blood was fine. My heart was fine. And just everything was great. The only thing was I was a nervous wreck and suffering terrific malnutrition and fatigue.
In other words, you were a starved idiot.
Yes, starved idiot. So Carlton was right standing by every day, and it was summertime in Boston, and boy, it was hot. You know, and all he had to do all day was either stay at the hospital during visiting hours, or just sit in that hotel. So anyway, we came to the last test, and they said we're going to take an encephalogram, an electroencephalogram, which is a brain test, you know. And all an electroencephalogram test is to record if there is a tumor or any kind of growth or anything like that in the brain. They just do that along with a physical checkup, a complete one. And I thought, oh my God, I've passed all the tests. Now they're going to record my brain, and they'll get down on paper my thoughts, and I'm a dead pigeon because they'll never let me out of here. And they didn't have an electroencephalogram machine at the hospital, but they had one at the Children's Hospital right next door to the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital. So we walked over there, and I went up to the 4th floor, and I was put into a little wire cage thing with a bed in it, and they stuck these wires on my head, and they had it there for the children, you know. And they had pink elephants and balloons in the room, and I was lying there, you know, crying, you know. This is the end of me. So, anyway, afterwards I said, does this record your thoughts? And they said, oh no, it's just, you know, they told me what it was for. So with a great sigh of relief, I started to leave the hospital, and I heard some children down the hall playing, and I asked who they were and what was wrong with them. And it was a hospital for mentally retarded children, little children on the top floor, mentally retarded. And then the rest of the hospital was more or less dedicated to rheumatic fever children. So I asked if I could see the little retarded children, so I looked at them, and they were so sweet, and they, and the nurse saw me. And word got around the hospital to the other children that I was there. And Carlton came up and he said, the kids want to see you. So I went and visited them. And they were so marvelous. They were so terrific that they really got me well, those children. And that first day I went to visit, and each ward had different age children, They started at about the age of 15, and the girls 15, some of them had been there for 12, 14 years now. And they were so delightful, and rheumatic fever children are very beautiful, Their eyes are marvelously lustrous and long eyelashes, and kind of a luminescent quality to the skin, and a luminous quality. And I finally got down to the 4 and 5 year olds, and they were in their little cribs, and they just hollered out, "Hello, Judy," and they were so brave and so down. And there was this one little child in the corner who looked at me, but she got all curled up in her bed and backed off into the corner of her bed. And I went to each child, and I talked to each one, and I asked the nurse what seemed to be wrong with the little girl who had such a frightened look.
How old was she?
Oh, 5. And they said that she had come from a family of 8 children who were all healthy. And the family was very ignorant, and they had hated her for her illness, and rejected her and beaten her up and everything because she was weak and sick, and she had stopped talking. And she hadn't talked for a couple of years, and they didn't know what to do to get her to talk, so I said, well, I'll just go over and visit with her. And for some reason, I just didn't ask her any questions. I didn't say, "Hello, how are you?" and "What's your name?" or anything. I just sat down on her bed and started to talk to her. And I told her that I was at the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital, and I thought about my little girl, and just a lot of things like that. And I went to the next child and so forth, and I left. Well, I went back to the hospital every day.
How long was it?
As long as I was in Boston.
How long in Boston?
I was in Boston about 3.5 months or 4 months. And in the meantime, Frank one day when I got better did bring a lot of people up to see me. And I got well enough to have a press reception at the hotel.
What kind of treatment did you do?
Just eating and sleeping.
You didn't take any pills?
No.
Or
No pills. No medication.
Absolutely none.
None.
None at all.
I was too full of medication. And they wanted me to stop all medication. And these migraine headaches were from malnutrition, Betadine, and sleeping tablets. From trying to keep up with a schedule that was impossible for me. So I finally did learn to sleep. After a while, I would go to sleep when I turned the lights out at night. And I learned to eat, and naturally started to put on weight. And they were delighted. So Frank came up and brought some friends, and I had a press reception at the hotel. Then Sylvia and her little boy, she was doing summer stock in through New England, and they came to the hotel. And finally the hospital said that I could go out now and then for the weekend. So
How long after your ride was this done?
Oh, well, this was about 4 months after.
Oh, after about 4 months they said you could
Yeah.
go out there.
I could go out.
You were not staying in the hospital all the time.
Oh, yeah, all the time. So we, with Sylvia and Carl...
You ever hear from your mother at all?
No.
Your sisters?
No. Nobody.
How about Vincent?
Oh, I heard from him.
Yeah.
But he finally, we would go on visits for the weekend. We'd go to different people's houses. I forget who they were very sort of wealthy people around Boston. And it was delightful. And they finally said that I could go on a 2 or 3 week holiday at Cape Cod just to see how I got along. So in the meantime, my little girl was with me. As soon as I got well enough, I sent for her, and she was in Boston with me. So Liza and I and Sylvia and Carlton went to Cape Cod.
They'll be there paying all the bills.
All the bills.
Nobody else.
Nobody else.
Not Manelli.
Right.
Just LB there.
Just me there. So we went to Cape Cod, and Liza and I had a little cabin. We went to a place called Coolumesset, I remember. It was a delightful place. And I
spelled Coolumesset.
Oh, I don't know.
C-O-O-M.
No. C on it. C-O-O-N-E-M-E-S-S-A-T or something.
I think I know what it is.
It's near Papanesset.
Yeah.
You know. So anyway, I got very tan and swimming every day, and Liza and I had a marvelous time together.
How old was Liza now?
Oh, Liza and I. About 2.5.
Yeah.
So, one night I had a very interesting experience. Hugh Martin, who had done the songs for me in St. Louis, had a show, his show Best Foot Forward, running in Papanesset. So I decided to go over and see it. So Carlton and Sylvia and I went over to see it, and of course, Hugh was playing the piano. They didn't have an orchestra, you know, it's just a little road company. And the lights went on, and there I was, and Hugh and the whole cast just about died. And we sat in the theater. We went back, they went out into the garden afterwards where we had hot dogs and things. And then Hugh said, would you sing for them, you know?
I mean, let me interrupt you here for 1 second. I want you to go back to the little 5-year-old girl. I know that you talked to her, you kept seeing her every day. Remember the little girl who wouldn't talk at all?
She wouldn't talk. And then
she hadn't spoken a word in years.
she hadn't spoken a word in years. And then I left after the 4-month visit, and talking to her every day.
Yes.
And seeing all the children every day. I went to Cape Cod. But I had to go back to Boston after Cape Cod, you see, to check in with the hospital.
All right, so you're with Hugh Martin and the cast, and the show was over.
So he asked me to sing. So I went back inside, and I hadn't sung for 4 months. And it was the first time in years that I really felt good. I had weight on me, and I was sleeping and eating, and I felt marvelous. I started to sing, and I had an entirely new voice. I had a much more powerful voice, and I've had that voice ever since. And it was the first night that I discovered it that night. So, anyway, we finished our 2 weeks, and I went back to the hospital. And they said it was all right for me to leave. In the meantime, Joe Pasternak had called me and said he wanted me for a picture called Summer Stock. Any time I got out of the hospital. Joe Pasternak was always wonderful to me. He was always saying, if I was half dead, I was better than anybody else. And any time that Freed would let me go, he'd use me in anything if I would just work with him. And he called me on the phone and said he wanted me for Summer Stock. Well, nobody had called me, and I was rather pleased. So I said I'd be back, and as soon as I came back, I would do it. So I went to see the children to say goodbye to them. And they knew that I was coming to say goodbye. And they were all of them had lipstick and lipstick on and their hair fixed, you know, the other ones. And each child had a little tiny bouquet of flowers from me. And it was very touching. And I finally got to the last ward where my little found child was. And I went in to say goodbye.
Do you remember?
No, I don't
remember.
But I went to each child. I finally got to her, and I sat down on the bed, and she was just staring at me. And then all the kids were saying goodbye, Judy, you know. And I was so grateful to these children because they had really made me well in those 4 months that I was there. So I got to her, and I said, now goodbye, and I hope you feel well. And she suddenly just jumped up on her knees, and she just, at the top of her lungs, she just said, Judy, and she started to cry with her arms around my neck. Her arms were clamped around my neck, and she just started to talk, and she talked and talked and talk, you know. Didn't make one bit of sense.
You know,
just don't leave, and my mother, and just everything, you know. But kept saying, don't leave, you know. So everybody was crying. The nurses were crying, and I was crying, and this child was just talking at the top of her lungs. You know. Didn't make one bit of sense.
You know,
just don't leave, and my mother, and just everything, you know. But kept saying, don't leave, you know. So everybody was crying. The nurses were crying, and I was crying, and this child was just talking at the top of her lungs. And I was holding on to her and rocking her. So Carlton came in, and he was weeping. And he said, we've got to go. We'll miss the train. I said, well, we'll just have to miss the train. I'm not going to leave this child right now. So while she's talking. So we missed the train, and I stayed with her, for a couple of hours while she talked. And finally she calmed down.
She talked constantly?
Just talked for 2 hours. Just talked. And finally she started to calm down. And I think they gave her a little sedative of some kind. Very mild. And she started to get a little sleepy. And I said, now I have to leave, because I have to go back and make a movie. But you must promise me something. Because she kept saying, I love you, you know. And I said, if you love me, you must promise me to talk to the nurses, because they love you very much too. So the nurses came over, and each one, I made her talk to each one of them, you know. And I waited until she went to sleep, and then I left. And all the kids were hanging out of the window at the hospital, yelling to me as I drove away. And I guess it was one of the great moments in my life when that child broke like that. And I felt that I didn't give a goddamn how many pictures I've been fired from, or how much humiliation. I had done a human being some good, you know. And I felt on top of the world, really. And the nurses called afterwards and kept in touch with me. And she progressed.
Waved goodbye to you out the window as you went away.
Yeah, and that was the end of the book.